Howdy everyone. Alright, so getting back to this gear leg, if I can back up for just a moment, there are actually a left and a right gear leg, so you can't interchange these legs. They are different enough that they are actually marked. There's a sticker on each one, so there is a dedicated left leg and a dedicated right leg. When you're building up your legs, it's very important, obviously, to be aware and maintain a left and a right of everything. So this is the left leg, and I have to use the mounting bracket for the wheel fairing. There's also a left and a right bracket. Make sure you have the appropriate bracket for the appropriate leg. So again, I'm building up the left leg. This is the left bracket. The wheel flanges are interchangeable and the brake calipers are interchangeable. However, out of the box, the brake calipers come pre-fitted with a bleed valve, with a bleed fitting. So this port is left open, but this bleed fitting is already installed. So there will be a left and a right brake caliper solely by looking at where or how this fitting is inserted. Now the Vange instructions will tell you that the brake caliper should be facing or should be mounted aft, on the aft side of the axle, with the bleed valve down toward the ground. So that's how you can distinguish left and right with your caliper. So again, left leg, left bracket. This is the flange from the left caliper. So I've got this pieced together momentarily. When you look at this oriented, again, this will be the left leg. So this will be this way. This will mount in this fashion here. So if you can imagine that this is the left side of the airplane, in this direction where I'm pointing, that's forward. So this would be the left leg, and this gets oriented just like that. You can see where my thumb is. That's the brake caliper mounting flange, where my thumb is. So the brake caliper is aft of the axle, which would be coming through here. And you can see that corner of the bracket that I was talking about. See how that cuts into that hole where the brake caliper is supposed to slide through? That's right up here. Let me put this down, or at least re-grab it so you can see. So that corner right there, that's the corner that needs to be relieved a little bit because the brake caliper will not fit through there. Of course, I don't have the bolts tight, but if you try to take your brake caliper and feed it through here, there's interference on this corner of the bracket. So what I'll do is I'll just hold this all together and I'll just kind of freehand trace out this corner where I want to relieve it. So that's what I'm going to do next. And then we can start a little bit of assembly work. So let me get that done and I'll be back here in a second. Oh, before I get too far, the other thing that you want to make sure of when you look at the plans and when you actually have your axle out, the order, if you will, in which the pieces parts go together. So again, this is the left side wheel. Forward is that way. So you can see that you have the brake mount and then the flange for the axle, the white powder coated flange, your spacer, and then the mounting bracket for the wheel fairings. So it's brake bracket, powder coated flange, spacer, and then your the mount, the bracket for the wheel fairing. All right, let me get this going. I'll be back here in a second. Howdy everyone. All right, you can see now that corner, how it's been cutouts so that there is plenty of clearance for the caliper to fit past it and slide into the brass boss on the caliper mounting bracket. All right, so again, that's all part of the prep work. While you have this together, make sure that the cutout, see if I can get my finger in here, the cutout on the bracket, make sure that it is cut out enough around the white powder coated flange here so that there's no interference between the bracket and the white powder coated part that slides over the axle. So you don't want any interference in here. You want to be able to set the bracket in place and get your bolts through easily with plenty of clearance here for the caliper and plenty of clearance around this white powder coated area here. And then again, always make sure that you're working with left and rights. So again, this is the left side forward is out in this direction here, and this sits just like that. All right. So now at this point, I believe I can start doing a little bit more pre-assembly. You have to have these parts actually bolted together. So I'm going to go ahead and bolt these three pieces together, and then I can fit them on the axle. You have to have these bolted together first because you can't put the parts on and put this bolt through. You can't have this flange bolted here through the axle first. You won't be able to get the other parts on. So you have to build these up as an assembly and then put this whole unit on as a whole. Now, since I've already built this one, I already know that besides my aluminum spacers here, besides having these aluminum spacers, I'm going to add a couple of washers. When you look at the plans, they show you here on the drawing, this is the brake rotor. Between the rotor and this is the bracket here that will support your wheel fairing. Between the bracket and this disc here for your brakes, you need a gap between those two, between 0.032 and 0.094 of an inch. When I had this right side put together with just the spacers, I had about 0.035 of a gap, and that was not enough for me. I wanted more of a gap. So since I added spacers on that one, I'm going to go ahead, since I added washers on that one, I'm going to go ahead and add the same amount of washers on this one just to open up that gap. Man, so here's what I'm referring to. Let me get this out of the way. This gap here, so here's the brake disc, the brake rotor, and here is that mounting bracket. This gap here between the two needs to be that 32 to 94 thousandths of an inch. It's not very accurate because this is very flimsy, and you can see you can bend this into any gap that you want. But in my personal opinion, it's better to have a larger gap than not enough gap. So I open this up. This is actually, depending on where you measure it, it's at least 0.094. It's a little bigger in some areas. I think down here it's a little bit more of a gap than over here. But I prefer it that way. I'd rather have more of a gap than not enough. And I don't know if you'll be able to see. No, you can't see the washers, but I'll show you that here in a minute. So I'm just going to add a couple of washers right here on top of the spacer, and then I'll put this back on. I'm going to go ahead and pre-assemble all of this, and then I'll fit it onto the axle, and then we'll move on to dealing with the wheel assembly and putting the brake caliper in place. So Stand by for that. Howdy everyone. Alright, so this is a good example on how easy it is to get things flipped around and backwards. When I had this assembled a minute ago and was showing you the orientation, I actually had it wrong. So this is now correct. So again, this is the left side. So the gear leg is coming out and up to the fuselage here. The axle sticks out here. This is where the tire would be. So this is left, that's forward. So you can see you have the gold-colored brake disc mounting flange, the caliper mounting flange. That goes on, if you will, it goes on the outside of the white powder-coated flange. So you have the caliper mount, then your white powder-coated flange, your spacers, your aluminum spacers, and potentially washers, and then your bracket, your fairing bracket. So you can see here, hopefully, caliper mount, powder-coated flange, spacers, potentially washers, and then your this bracket here. Washers spacers are only on 3 points. If I spin this around, remember the bracket wraps around here, so there's a spacer under these 3 long bolts and potentially washers, and this is just a shorter bolt. The bracket obviously does not come around to this bolt, so this is a lot shorter. And again, the cutout here, this corner cutout for the caliper to slide through here nicely. So this is the appropriate orientation. You can see the through hole here in relation to the rest of the setup. You'll note that the brake bracket, this knurled part here is solid. This knurled part here looks like it's divided up into 2 pieces. They are both the same. I don't believe it matters, but I have this oriented just like it came off of the brake caliper. So this caliper is actually going to go, it's going to go on in this fashion here. That's how this bracket was originally shipped with the caliper. It was this way. It wasn't this way. So the solid knurling was closest to the caliper. So that's how I have it oriented rather than having it flipped around this way. I don't know that it matters, but I just want to keep everything uniform. So the way that the bracket was mounted on the caliper when it came out of the box is the way that I want to have it oriented on the axle. Again, don't think it matters, but that's just how my mind works. So now this is correct. I'm going to go ahead and tighten up these bolts, and then I'm going to verify after the bolts are tight that this caliper will still slide through those bosses. I had a little bit of an issue with this one when I bolted it together. I was noticing a gap between the bottom of the bolt head and the bracket, so I tightened it down to get rid of that gap, and apparently it pulled on this bracket in such a way that these 2 bosses were no longer parallel, and I couldn't get the brake caliper to slide in and out nicely, so I had to do some tweaking on the bracket. I didn't want to loosen the bolts, so I just tweaked the bracket to get that to fit nice. Just something to be aware of. Let me get this tightened up, and I'll come right back.